So this presentation is to demonstrate a decision support tool that we put together with funding from NYSERDA and in partnership with New York City Parks. And we had a lot of support from the Nature Conservancy, New York DEC, and other stakeholders as well. This is a basic box plot for the conceptual model here. The concept is that we will take SLAMM results where we model different adaptive strategies, different actions, and we integrate, we look at the results, define the ecosystem values, what it is that people value about various marshes, and we can then integrate the relative parcel value over time. If you have a concept of the cost of these adaptation strategies by parcel, then you can result in a cost-benefit metric. So I'm going to do this presentation a little bit differently than we've done it in the past. I'm going to start by going through a fairly rapid executive summary where I go through the full cycle of the project. Then I'm going to go into some more details following that. And after I finish the executive summary, I will stop and see if there's any questions in the chat box at that time. So we are Warren Pinnacle Consulting. We're a micro-sized consulting firm, actually even a little bit more micro-sized than you see in this picture because Amy has left to work for the state of Vermont environmental agency. And so it's just Marco and I holding down the fort at the moment. And SLAMM, as many of you are aware, is the sea level affecting marshes model. And this model will give you estimates of marsh fate over time under different sea level rise scenarios. So we started out the project with a set of fairly high resolution SLAMM model runs. And when you run the model with a number of different sea level rise scenarios, for example, for New York, we're using the 2016 New York Governor's Office sea level rise scenarios, you end up with a predicted set of marsh maps for any number of time steps along this. So this could potentially, looking at this kind of scenario, you could end up with approximately 50 maps of output. However, we then realized that trying to come up with a single output for a single sea level rise scenario at a single year, there's a lot of uncertainty involved, both in terms of the input data, in terms of the sea level rise, the driving data, and in terms of other pieces like what will future marsh erosion rates be like, what will future tide ranges be like, and what will future accretion rates feedback, and what will be the strength of the feedback between sea level rise and the vertical movement of marshes. So if you account for all these uncertainties simultaneously, you end up with a distribution of outputs. So instead of moving from the scale of dozens of maps, you get now to the scale of hundreds or even thousands of maps that you're looking at. So there's a tremendous amount of data that is being produced here, a lot of information. But it leads us to the key question, what do we do with all that information and what's next? So for this project, we took 4 concrete actions, concrete steps to try to answer that question. The first one was to simulate actions that can be taken, adaptive management strategies specifically, and to estimate the cost of those actions. And the second is to define individual marsh parcels to see how they fare under different adaptation managements and under different scenarios. The uncertainty analysis results we can collapse using a concept called expected value, and then finally use sort of a microeconomic model to examine the relative value of marshes based on stakeholder values and other factors such as their location, adjoining infrastructure, depending on what's being valued about those marshes. So the adaptation strategies that we have modeled with SLAMM, we start with a base case, which would be, let's look at the current existing marsh with no migration. So that would assume that adjoining undeveloped and developed lands would somehow be protected from marsh expansion, which is probably true in the case, especially with its high property values in many of these areas. Another possibility is to allow migration to undeveloped dry lands to public lands or to buy out private lands or purchase easements. Then there's also the possibility of restoration of developed lands that may be adjacent to marshes that would be suitable for marsh colonization, whether it be roads or parking lots or even structures. New York City Parks was particularly interested in marsh restoration to the 1974 marsh footprint because that's one area where you can move away from the, you can restore marsh and not necessarily have to worry as much about land acquisition. We did look at thin layer deposition, what would happen if you currently applied 20 centimeters of additional elevation capital to low marshes, to regularly flooded marshes. And for other projects, we've also modeled the restoration of tidal flows in muted tidal regions, because that makes a very big difference in terms of tide range, makes a very big difference in terms of marsh vulnerability, and also the elevations that can be colonized by marshes. So then the next question we come to is how to move from confidence intervals to decisions. So this was a result of our previous SLAMM project for New York City, looking at coastal marsh hectares. This is assuming that marshes are allowed to migrate onto dry land. But you can see there's a very large uncertainty here in 2100. Are marsh levels going to remain about the same? Are they actually going to increase because of the cases of migration? So this outer confidence interval is the confidence interval that includes the uncertainty in sea level rise. The inner confidence interval with these dotted lines would be assuming a single sea level rise scenario. So you can see that the sea level rise scenario itself is really driving the majority of this uncertainty, even though this confidence interval is taking into account data uncertainty, accretion uncertainty, tide range, all those other uncertainties combined. So the way that we collapse all these pieces together is, as I said, by using this economic expected value concept, which is really the sum of the value of each occurrence multiplied by the probability of its occurrence. And this, in this example here, we're looking specifically at high marshes, and you can see that they are not predicted to fare as well. But the confidence interval will be these black lines. Different sea level rise scenarios are these colored lines. And each of these gray lines represents a single uncertainty simulation. So the confidence interval is fairly wide, but a lot of the density here is at the lower end. And so what you would do is look at the value of each of these iterations. In our uncertainty analysis, each of these lines is assumed to be equally likely based on the way that we set up the uncertainty analysis. So again, going back to this sort of conceptual box plot, I want to actually focus on the lower part of this. So if we take out this concept of defining utilities and what you value about each site, you still have a pretty powerful tool where you have SLAMM model results for different adaptive strategies, and then you can have a predicted total marsh acres given the adaptation strategy. And this is multiple boxes here because we're assuming there are multiple adaptive strategies that are modeled. And then with the cost, you can get a cost-benefit metric. So when we look at this in one of our case studies, this is our New York City case study where we defined 6 distinct marsh parcels. The findings are that you can really get, these are the acres of persistent marsh that you would get per $1 million spent. And a persistent marsh is one that would be predicted to exist throughout the study time period, which is 2016 to 2100. So if you had a marsh that was only going to persist for 10 years, it wouldn't have any value, but it would have about 1/9 of the value of a marsh that was going to persist throughout the whole time period. And so per $1 million spent, these are the benefits of the different adaptation strategies. So in areas like Pelham Bay Cove, which is largely the migration footprint, the potential marsh migration footprint is largely publicly owned, there's very little cost to allowing that marsh migration, especially because these are owned by city parks. And so that becomes the most competitive. In other sites where there's a lot of private land, a lot of developed land, which would be expensive to allow for migration or potentially less migration location, then restoring the marsh to 1974 becomes more competitive. We were interested that our results did not show a lot of persistent marsh benefits for thin layer deposition, a finding that I'll get into in more detail going forward. However, that's a very interesting result in itself. But the concept that we had coming into this is that all marsh is not valued equally, depending on what you value about a marsh. So if you're valuing wave attenuation, for example, a marsh island that is not protecting any infrastructure would have a lower relative value than a marsh island, than a marsh that is adjacent to a lot of infrastructure. For nutrient sequestration, if you're looking at nitrogen and phosphorus sequestration, it would depend on the marsh location, whether there are farmlands or developed lands nearby, which would require a lot more nutrient sequestration. And it goes through, for all the different things that stakeholders value about marshes, there are different considerations. And so I want to focus now on the upper part of this, where we created a microeconomic model to try to define the ecosystem values, the relative ecosystem values for each site. And just to be clear, this is a microeconomic model, but one that tries to maximize utility. It does not try to maximize dollars as many economic models do. So we define a relative utility of each site, and we define these utility functions which help us go from a SLAMM result to a benefit. So, for example, for wave attenuation, we would be calculating the width of the marsh. For carbon sequestration, we would be looking at both the acreage and the type of the marsh, because we know that some marshes have a better capability for carbon sequestration than others. So there were really 4 areas which we gathered stakeholder input for this project. The first was what we call our ecosystem services list. So the question is, what is it that you specifically value about these wetlands? Is it a recreation? Is it habitat benefit, wave attenuation, et cetera? Then once we gathered our ecosystem services list, which we gathered through phone calls, in-person workshop, and emails, we defined the relationship between those ecosystem services and some sort of SLAMM output, whether it's a marsh area or a geometric metric, which I've discussed a little bit to point. But some of the other concepts could be the marsh to open water interface is particularly important for Nexton habitat, for example. And then you can get input from stakeholders in terms of how much, what their ranking is for these different ecosystem services. So different agencies, different individuals may have different importance that they place on these different pieces. And that's one of the things about the tool, is it's designed to be flexible so that you can go in and change those, what you value, and see if that has any difference in terms of the maximized strategy for your agency or for you as an individual. Finally, we spent some time looking at site-specific strengths and weaknesses. Again, so for example, you might have a marsh island that has great width, has a great potential for wave attenuation, but is not actually protecting any infrastructure. So those are the kind of details that you need to bring into the model. When you put all these together, you get sort of an aggregated total utility of each marsh over time. So this is, again, the New York City case study, and we have the 6 sites that we're looking at. In this case, the 2 largest marshes are providing us with the largest benefits, just because some of these are directly related to the marsh size, like nutrient sequestration, potentially habitat connectivity, or fragmentation. But you can see sort of the strengths and the weaknesses of each marsh. Tiny Udall's Cove in Queens actually has a much better, much higher impact in terms of wave attenuation than does the larger W.T. Davis, just as a basis of its location and the width of the marsh that is predicted. You can also look at the benefits of these different strategies over time. So you have your sort of current ecosystem benefit, and then over time looking at all these different strategies. If you allow for migration, the total amount of marsh is increasing. You actually would potentially be predicted to have a better utility of time. If you restore to 1974 but don't allow for any migration, you're going to have some upfront benefits which are going to taper off over time. Another piece of this is that we allow for the continuation of historic losses. It's an interesting observation that marshes have been lost overall in the New York study area that we've been looking at since 1974 to current maps, but that would not be predicted on the basis of sea level rise alone. We have had historic sea level rise, but it has been low enough that measured marsh accretion rates or marsh elevation changes have should have just pretty much kept up with them. So the SLAMM model would not predict these kind of losses. So and neither would any of the other marsh fate models. Some of them which even have stronger feedbacks in terms of predicting even less vulnerability than the SLAMM model does. This you can assume that they're additive, and that can see if that has a change. If it was a function of, let's say, excessive nutrients that's causing marsh dieback, or the use of herbicides, or some sort of boat traffic. So if you assume, you can then also take a look and see the impact that that has on your predictions. Adding all these pieces together, you end up with a total wetland benefit by site and adaptation strategy. So if you look at these results, they're similar to what we had before, because it's still inexpensive to add marsh at Pelham Bay or W.T. Davis, just because there's a lot of publicly owned land there, and those costs are lower. If you look at Udall's Cove in Queens, the restoring to 1974 becomes even more competitive than it was before, and in fact, that may be the place that you would consider restoring marsh first, as opposed to some of these other locations, because it has more overall benefits. The study area that we considered was all of coastal New York, with the exception of the Hudson Valley. And we have 3 different case studies that we put together for different counties, and we ended up looking at 35 coastal marsh parcels overall across those. So to jump to some of our our most significant case study findings. Now, given the cost assumptions that we had in the model and the assumptions in terms of how it was going to be implemented, we did not find that thin layer deposition was cost effective compared to other strategies. And part of the reason for that is that we have a dynamic accretion feedback model in the model, which shows that as marshes increase in elevation, as you move to the right here, that their elevation change decreases. So you're adding elevation capital, but you are decreasing the speed at which the marsh is moving vertically. And so over time, you'd expect the marsh surfaces to equilibrate, and so it would be a sort of a limited time benefit that you would get for thin layer deposition. And the other finding that I'll cover a little bit more detail is that we just found that 20 centimeters of elevation capital in terms of looking over on a decadal time scale is relatively unimportant for low marshes. Another case study finding was that we really could get the largest quantity of benefits via managed retreat, allowing the colonization of adjacent lands. It's not necessarily always cost effective, depending on your cost assumptions, but it provides you with the most persistent set of marshlands that give you the longest term benefits. So that is the executive summary of the project, and I'm going to go through some more topics and details. If people have questions up front that they want to type into the chat box, that's fine. Otherwise, I will continue to soldier on through some of these other topics. I want to talk a little bit about some of the refinements we did to the SLAMM model quickly. We included storm surge modeling and infrastructure. I want to talk a little bit about marsh collapse. A little bit more about the elevation change model that we looked at and its implications. Some of the intermediate products. So if you're not really necessarily looking for a cost-benefit analysis, there's still some very interesting intermediate products available. And then also to go into more details on the DMMT itself. the first topic I want to discuss is storm surge and infrastructure. We did not actually model the impact that storm surge has on marshes because it's kind of uncertain in terms of what's going to happen in terms of if you have a 1 in 10 year flood of an upland. We would not assume a 1 in 10 year flood of an upland would be enough to convert that to a marshland, so you wouldn't have that kind of an impact. So this is really on dry lands, just where the dry land map is, where these floods would occur, and also impact on infrastructure, which infrastructure is subject to flooding under these circumstances. So we had two different products that we were working with. We had some still water elevation data that was available from a NYSERDA project by Dewberry that did include sea level rise, so we incorporated that. And then we also had the floodplain FEMA layer that we just added sea level rise to for New York City. So we're really looking at the combination of sea level rise plus storm surge and what the predictions might be. And we looked at a lot of road and point infrastructure. We got a number of point data sets from NOAA, from the Nature Conservancy was a major source of these data, from the New York State GIS Clearinghouse. And then also we looked at road flooding predictions from New York State DOT, where the data layer is available there. This is an example from Westchester County. So this is the current prediction of flooding, and so this would be like these would be areas that would be a 30-day flood are in red, and then the blue colors would be for storm surges. So these are areas that will be flooded every month. Now, when we looked at these in this area, for example, our digital elevation map is bare earth, and these are actually bridges. So what we did was we actually cut out the areas that are currently flooded in terms of the impacts from sea level rise. But if you look at 1 meter of sea level rise and 2 meters of sea level rise, you can see that you have an expansion of the regularly flooded roads, which would probably start to make them untenable for regular travel, and also an expansion in terms of where the storm surge would be predicted to go. And here is a model prediction for Nassau County near Lido Beach. I don't know if it's Lido or Lido. Apologize. Anyway, so this is a prediction under a moderate sea level rise in 2085 under a medium sea level rise scenario, which would be about 1 meter by 2100. So this is under 1 meter of sea level rise, and you can see there are extensive areas here in red that are already predicted to be flooded once per month, and then the storm surge affects very large areas as well. So we did have a little bit of road flooding verification. There was an article in a site called NewYorkCurb.com which showed a number of sites which are already flooding on a regular basis. And what we managed to do was locate these based on the road name and based on Google Street View, find exactly where the house is, and find that the SLAMM model is already predicting these to have, in all these sites which they had pictured, we are already predicting flooding. So also, we did a similar infrastructure set of work in Connecticut, and they did a similar kind of verification, even finding some tidal marsh right immediately adjacent to the road. So we have it's not an extensive, unbiased, boots on the ground model verification, but we're certainly in the right ballpark in terms of the areas that are currently flooding. Gives you a little bit more faith that the future model predictions will be accurate. And you can aggregate all of these together. So these, the lower sea level rise scenarios here show the 30-day inundation that's predicted for Suffolk County. Under the lowest sea level rise scenario, it's supposed to go up to potentially 20 kilometers by 2100, but under the highest, it'll be over 150 kilometers. And above that would be when you include a 10-year storm. So already, you've got approximately 100 kilometers vulnerable to a 10-year storm, but that it could more than double depending on the sea level rise scenario that you are looking at. In terms of, you can also look at it on a county-by-county basis. You can see that New York City does have the highest kilometer. However, the Suffolk County was split into the west and east So Suffolk might even have higher vulnerability. But if you look at the lower sea level rise, it's actually the western portion of Suffolk County that has the highest kilometers under the lower sea level rise. A lot of these other areas, you don't really start seeing impacts until you get to half a meter of sea level rise. Point infrastructure is also looked at. These are school inundation frequencies across the study area with 30-day floods. This is a worst-case scenario. It's 2,100 at the high sea level rise scenario, but it gives you a sense of where the vulnerable infrastructure is. And across the entire study area, it's clearly focused on the western portion of it and the southwest, to be more precise. Suffolk County has a lot less vulnerability than does the other counties. There is a fair amount of uncertainty in terms of we didn't verify the location of all these point infrastructure data. We did pull out a few that we found to be errant, but we had so many data points, we didn't really have the capability to do that. So there is also some uncertainty in terms of the specific locations of all of these and whether each facility is specifically vulnerable or not, but it certainly gives you a sense that there's a pattern, something going on there. Okay, so now I want to talk a little bit about how we model the dynamics of marshes, which, unlike dry land, move up and down as a function of sea level rise, as a function of salinity, et cetera. So the two pieces that I want to talk about are the mechanistic accretion modeling that we did for this project and how we accounted for that in uncertainty, and also the marsh collapse piece. So these are the models that we derived. We actually ran Jim Morris's MEM model, which is a mechanistic accretion model which calculates sediment deposition as a function of the marsh's elevation, as a function of the total suspended solids, and all those other pieces. And we calibrated his model to the available data that we had from set tables, from long-term set tables. And the models that we had were relatively similar. And again, what you're looking at here on the horizontal axis is the elevation of the marsh, of the low marsh. So if you have your minimum salt marsh elevation, it's going to be moving vertically fastest. When you get to the maximum salt marsh elevation, which is above, just slightly above high tide line, it's going to be accreting at the lowest potential level. And again, this has impacts in terms of over time, you expect that you would have a marsh platform that would equilibrate, and that is in fact what you find for the most part are relatively flat surfaces among the marsh platform, with the exception of potential levees right near the water edge. But there's a lot of uncertainty in that model, and we tried to account for that by looking at the uncertainty in the data that we use, the set data, their current elevation, the rate of change that they looked at. So this is an actual MEM result here, which is why it's a little squiggly in this black line. And this is the uncertainty interval that we placed. So basically any of these potential accretion feedbacks were accounted for in the uncertainty analysis. The other piece that we looked at was the loss of elevation capital that can happen due to marsh conversion. Working with David Burdick at UNH, there's a number of studies which show that marshes can collapse due to a change in pore water salinity. You have a change in your bacterial composition within the marshes. You can have a marsh collapse, or you can simply have the soil structure, the soil matrix. The organic matter can break down very quickly. And David Burdick found when he looked at this, when he was looking at a high marsh conversion, that is a irregularly flooded marsh getting regularly flooded, so probably increasing in salinity, he found an average loss of about 7 centimeters, and for low marsh, he found about 17 centimeters. So the interesting is when we looked at this on the model predictions, it had much lower effect than we expected at the beginning of the project. So on top here we have the regularly flooded marsh, or the sometimes called the low marsh category, probably the most saline marsh, expected to be flooded on most days. Under a low sea level rise scenario, so what we have is two lines here. We have a blue line, which is without marsh collapse, and a red line that is with marsh collapse. Under low sea level rise scenarios, these marshes are not lost or gained dramatically, and impact is not really there. Under high sea level rise scenarios, you have a marsh collapse occurring. You have a marsh collapse occurring because you have a loss of these regularly flooded marsh categories, but then you're actually losing your regularly flooded marsh anyway, and so the fact that you have a slight difference here, it doesn't make any impact over time. So we really only saw impacts of marsh collapse under sort of the moderate sea level rise scenarios, and in case of tidal flat, eventually things equilibrate because you're losing that tidal flat. In the case of regularly flooded marsh, they don't quite equilibrate, but they may. I'm guessing that if you followed this through time further, you'd have those lines close up again. And again, so this question is the concept that we've come up with is that something in the order of 10 to 20 centimeters of elevation capital for a low marsh and tidal flat is of limited consequence. So this leads me to one of the questions that I see from Patrick Christ. How generalizable is the finding that thin layer deposition is not cost effective over time? I think that's a really good question, and I don't. I think that it's something that should be looked at closely and see whether other models have a similar prediction in terms of the effects of thin layer deposition. We did talk to some other Marsh fate modelers, Matt Kirwan in particular, and asked him about his opinion of thin layer deposition, and his concept was, yes, you're going to basically things are going to equilibrate over time, and so to a certain extent you may be buying time with the marshes. And also, I don't know the cost assumptions in the model. We'll have to go back and look at those very closely, and I'll show you how that is done further on. So it's an interesting initial finding. I don't think that I would say, okay, well, thin layer deposition is just throw it away. It's not worth looking at. We should look at other. But I do think it should be looked at closely compared to other adaptation strategies, and maybe the same kind of analysis. Looking at, we have a pretty good range of. I mean, there's a reasonable range of tide ranges within the study area, which could have an impact. So we did thin layer deposition on both microtidal and larger tide range areas, and we never found it to be competitive across our study area. But there may be different assumptions about the strength of accretion feedbacks that could be incorporated and costs. So. And this is an example of differences in marsh predictions with marsh collapse. So you have this orange color, which is a high marsh, and it's converted under this medium scenario. It's converted to a blue this blue, which is a regularly flooded marsh, a regularly flooded marsh, and tidal flat. And on the right here, under marsh collapse, there's more open water showing. So it's not a dramatic difference, but there is a potentially different there, especially under moderate sea level rise scenarios. Next thing I want to talk about are the intermediate products, some of the uncertainty analysis and adaptation strategy layers. So again, from uncertainty analysis, you go from one map per sea level rise scenario per time step to hundreds of maps per time step. And so the way that we solved that was to look at the percent likelihood, create percent likelihood maps. So you have a percent likelihood that existing marsh will remain. They'll give you a sense of vulnerability across all of the model uncertainty and sea level rise uncertainty. Percent likelihood that there's new coastal marsh. This is to show marsh migration pathways. It's going to be a very useful map. And there's a number of different things. Likelihood that habitat will change. So again, overall ecosystem vulnerability. Whether you're looking at coastal marsh, coastal wetland, which includes beaches, flooded development. So we produce about 10 of these different maps. And here's an example of some of those from Staten Island. If you look at the likelihood of habitat change by 2085, you see the red colors here is the highest likelihood. So in the northwestern portion of Staten Island has the highest vulnerability to sea level rise, although there are pockets in the southeast as well that are vulnerable. This blue color means that there's a lower probability. So this area could have habitat change. There could be flooding in this area that would cause a change in habitat type. But it's a lower probability. It would be under the higher sea level rise scenarios, somewhere in the order of 10% chance. Then percent likelihood of coastal marsh. So where is there going to be marsh by 2085? This is assuming you're allowing marsh to migrate into undeveloped lands. So again, the pockets in the northwest and the southeast have the highest probability. In terms of there being new coastal marsh, however, it's in the northwest that's the highest. Then this map here is the likelihood that something that's currently a land or a wetland converts to open water. And it can also help you identify marsh migration pathways. For example, in Nassau County and Sands Point, by 2040, there are only a few areas that might become marsh. By 2100, you can see really where the new marsh would be predicted to inhabit. We also produce these same kind of probability maps for each adaptation strategy that we modeled. So in this case, I'm going to take a look at some results from Thorn Preserve and Gardner County Park area in Suffolk County. So the current marsh footprint is that we have some high marsh in the orange color here, or irregularly flooded marsh. You have some swamp that's behind it, and then a lot of dry land and development that's behind that, the red and the dark red. But the total maximum marsh expansion, this would be worst case scenario under the highest sea level rise, extends into that habitat. So this is you can look at, this map is pretty interesting. It's the probability of the current marsh persistence in 2100. And because this area does not have a big tide range, these marshes do not inhabit a wide elevation band, and so the probability that the current marsh will persist is actually fairly low, only about 10% to 20%, maybe 30% in some of these marshes that are further inland. So there's an impact that is predicted there. If you look at the probability of marsh expansion on undeveloped land, you can see it's about 50-50 in terms of some of these middle marshes, and then lower possibility in some of the upper marshes. If you combine all dry land, it just fills in some of the holes where those developed areas are. And then we also look at thin layer deposition. And the way to look at this, I'm actually moving to a different site because at that other location, we didn't predict that we were going to be applying a lot of thin layer deposition because most of the marshes there were classified as irregularly flooded high marshes. And for this project, we looked at only applying thin layer deposition to low marshes, to regularly flooded marshes. But in the W.T. Davis study area, we applied that, and you can see that this is what you can look at then is the probability of there being a marsh subtracted by you would subtract the probability of there being a marsh with no action from the probability there's a marsh with action. There's a lot of very light pink and beige colors here, suggesting that a lot of these areas will have about a 10% increase. Not many areas that would have an increase higher than that in this particular study area. Interestingly enough, however, there's some areas here that have higher impacts to the outside the defined parcel. Okay, so now I'm going to talk a little bit about the DMMT, which is what we call our decision support tool, the dynamic marsh management tool. And I think this will answer Patrick's other question as I go through this. So I want to talk about how ecosystem benefits are calculated, how they're ranked, the utility functions, and the mechanics of the tool. So this project was inspired by work by Sam Merrill, who's currently of GEI Consultants. He did some of this similar kind of work, except instead of using a Marsh fate model, he used a simpler model just of water levels. So we're definitely in debt to his insight and his foresight to the use of this kind of usefulness of this kind of a microeconomic model. But we, from workshopping the ecosystem benefits and starting with a list that he put together, we came up with this rough list of ecosystem benefits. So nutrient sequestration, whether it be carbon or nitrogen or phosphorus, and then a number of different possibilities that marshes assist in recreation, whether it's school groups visiting wetlands, natural services to underserved communities was of particular interest to New York City parks. Nekton habitat that's proximate to fishing areas, so these marshes may be serving as important habitat to allow for fishing. So these are human-centered recreational benefits. Then we have just more general habitat benefits. Nekton habitat, the small fish and small organisms, forage fish really benefit from a marsh to open water interface, so we can pull that out of the SLAMM model. Looking at habitat connectivity using geometric metrics. Looking at bird habitat, which is often high marsh, the irregularly flooded marsh is more important for bird habitat. So because the SLAMM model separates those two out, we can look at losses of irregularly flooded marsh and the impact that would have on bird habitat. Talked quite a bit about wave attenuation, and then some of these other concepts, whether a marsh has a political or historic value or essential to the culture of a community, for example. So I want to talk a little bit about how these utility functions are used to move from SLAMM predictions to ecosystem values. And I'll just look at a couple of cases. In a lot of cases, we went pretty heavily to the literature in this case. For example, this paper by Loomis and Kraft showing the differences and benefits of different types of marshes, all which are modeled within the SLAMM model, and the relative impacts in terms of carbon sequestration, nitrogen sequestration, and phosphorus sequestration. So those can be brought directly into the model, and you can look at two different marsh parcels, calculate the acres that they have of these three different categories, and then look at the relative benefit of that and get a relative carbon sequestration benefit from these two different parcels and a relative nitrogen and a relative phosphorus. So all of these are being calculated relative to one another and normalized, which I will discuss in just a moment how that's done. For wave attenuation, the general rule of thumb is that it's proportional to marsh width, and that's the simplification that we have in the model. I mean, this paper by Walmsley says, in truth, it's also a function of the storm direction and how the marsh is located proximate to the developed land that's being protected, but those are at least the former, the storm direction is unknown. So in terms of how proximate it is to developed land, we really added a lot of site-specific weights to consider the land and the infrastructure being protected by a marsh. So some of the marshes really don't have a lot of flood wave attenuation benefits and others do. And as I was saying, we found some literature that suggested that the salt marsh edge is an especially important habitat, and so we use the marsh to open water interface that's predicted to get at that. So the next thing that we did, now we have the relative ecosystem services for each of these parcels. We ranked those, and this is a value where you basically say, okay, maybe I'm an agency that is interested in human-centered benefits, so I'm going to weight those as twice important, or give zero weight to some of these other. And so it can be an individual or an agency's opinion in terms of how they weight these. And the DMMT tool is very flexible. It allows you to just go in with these existing case studies, change these rankings, rerun the model, and within a couple of minutes you can get a sense of the impact that had. And it's an Excel-based tool, the DMMT, and it's all open source. It has a Visual Basic core behind it, and it basically reads from results that are extracted from SLAMM and does these calculations. And so the inputs are also in Excel, and this is just kind of what it looks like. So there are also site-specific weighting, as I discussed previously. For example, if you have information about marsh density, you may include that in terms of that would be a marsh that would be more effective at sequestering carbon potentially. or the nutrient sequestration would be a function of the, whether it's marsh is adjacent to a golf course or an agricultural field or development versus being adjacent to woodlands. And in the tool, these are listed below, and they're relative to one another, and they need not add to 100. They get normalized by the model after. And so this gets to the point I was saying is that ultimately all of these relative benefits are normalized so that the average utility of each site at the simulation start, given no action, is equal to its ecosystem relative rank. What that basically means is the average total utility of all the sites is going to be equal to 100. It also means that because these are all relative calculations, one parcel versus another, you shouldn't compare these utilities across DMMT applications, but you're really comparing the parcels that are within the tool at one time. So, for example, this is looking at a simulation where we're looking at migration to all dry land. So this is really the most optimistic assumption that can be put into place, and there's no historic marsh loss. But the most optimistic assumption that can be put in place in terms of whether marsh will be allowed to migrate or transgress into adjacent lands. And the average utility across these 6 sites is 100. So Alley Creek is giving you about the average utility. These other 2 very large sites, because they have so much marshland that's doing so much of the sequestering of nutrients, et cetera, or have higher utility. Udall's Cove, being the smallest marsh, has the lowest utility. You can see over time, Udall's Cove is increasing in its utility. Some of these larger sites, they start by increasing due to marsh migration, but then there's a higher probability of marsh loss at the end of the time period. And again, this is the most optimistic. And I discussed a little bit about the historic loss model, and it's just I think it's an important way to look at the results. Say, okay, some of these results may be a little bit overly optimistic because we're looking at only sea level rise effect. Let's look at non-sea level rise effects and assume that they continue, or look at some bounding analysis. So you can play with the historic marsh loss and see if that has any impact, or whatever marsh loss you'd like to project, and see if that has any impact on what the best management strategy is. So I think that's a good way to look at this tool is say, okay, the best management strategy is this, but what if my preferences are different? Do we still have the same strategy, and what if the costs are different? Do we still have the same strategy, and what if the historic losses accounted for? Do we have the same strategy? And if you start getting the same answer across those, then you can start feeling more comfortable with your model results. These are the 6 parcels that we've been looking at in New York City. You can see they vary quite a bit in terms of size. And this is the incremental sort of benefits in terms of wetland benefits that are provided over the entire simulation period. So we've moved from 100 is the average, but then you're doing this over 86 years, so you have much higher sort of aggregate utility. And you can see that for migration to all dry land, Alley Creek has the largest capability, but it might be the most expensive. This does not incorporate costs. In our simulation, I mean, we had to go back and check the results a lot and make sure that we're adding the 20 centimeters where we thought we were adding the 20 centimeters, but the results from the SLAMM model with the accretion feedbacks, when you're looking over an 86-year time period, were quite a bit lower. You can see for a single strategy for migration, again, this is kind of what we were looking at before. Alley Creek, Queens has the largest capability for wetland benefits due to migration, and Lemon Creek has the least in terms of the defined parcel. This is a little bit of an interesting graph that comes out of the model automatically. It looks at the current utility in 2016 of these different marsh systems, and then it looks at the no action as the second bar. So you can, in 2100. So you can see for the assumptions that are in the place in this model, you're losing about 3/4 of your utility for Idlewild. But if you start to add in some of these other pieces, such as migration to undeveloped dry land, you're almost back to where you were. If you allow migration to developed dry land, you even increase things a little bit. Thin layer deposition is this next bar, so it's not nothing, but and then the final bar is the restoration to 1974. So this would be all adaptation strategies simultaneously. So it gives you a little bit of a sense of what's going on. If you consider historic marsh loss as additive to sea level rise loss, the results are a little bit less optimistic, where for Idlewild, if you do all adaptation strategies, you're still not going to be quite where you were at the current condition. But for some of the other marshes, like Alley Creek, you could still get back to where you were. Another piece that comes out of this tool is looking at a specific site. It'll give you an expected land cover acreage. So, for example, this is W.T. Davis over time. This is the currently existing marsh. And you can see the high marsh, you're going to lose about 2/3 of it. The low marsh is going to double. So this is a conversion of high marsh to low marsh, and a lot of the tidal flat habitat is going to disappear according to these model predictions. However, if you allow for migration, you still have a total loss of wetlands. You can see that these are the wetland categories going down, but you're losing considerably less than you are. We already discussed a little bit these components of utility and how you can pull out. So this is where you get some results that are a little bit different, where the fact that you have this utility model, this wetland benefit model built in, can result in results that are a little bit different than just looking at total acres. For example, the importance of flood attenuation in Udall's Cove and Lemon Creek versus Pelham Bay Cove. Wave attenuation. You can, I've already discussed how you can see these benefits over time. You can see how these things change, and thin layer deposition is a minor benefit. Marsh restoration is a big benefit up front, and then when you allow for migration, things sort of increase. Then we also, this is a key component of this, and we did I would say, with the help of New York City Parks, we did a moderately intense effort to estimate the average cost. So what we haven't done is sort of gone in site-specific and looked at the value of each parcel that was on those sites. But what we did was look at the public-to-private breakdown, and we used these data that were produced by New York City Parks in terms of the cost of acquisition of easement or easement on private properties, transfer or easements. They also had categories for marsh restoration and the conversion of developed land to allow for marsh migration. So what we did in our initial case study was they had high and low cost estimates, which are quite far apart. So we used the midpoint between those. So that's another thing that I think that's another place where this is should be considered a case study, where you look at these. You really have to pin down the cost to get a sense of the benefit per cost. And if we were off by our, on some things like thin layer deposition, if we're quite a bit off, that could have a big impact on whether it is cost effective or not. So again, we looked at the public to private breakdown. We considered areas that were developed that those would need to be purchased. Private land that was undeveloped, we assumed that there might be an easement that could be purchased in those cases. And then you end up with your estimated wetland benefits per unit cost. And what we're seeing is that for Pelham Bay Cove and W.T. Davis, because of the public to private breakdown and the land being available less expensively, that becomes the best strategy there. For these other sites, Restoration 1974 is for Udall's Cove, Queens, is very beneficial. And then even thin layer deposition, there are some differences in terms of how effective it is on a dollar basis, and that's the basis of the tide range, the current marsh capital, and how much of an impact that has. The current marsh elevation capital is what I mean to say. If you look at this with historic losses, you still get the Pelham Bay and W.T. Davis migration being competitive. The marsh restoration becomes less. A lot of that marsh that you're restoring becomes part of that marsh which is lost. So it's a question of whether that restored marsh can be protected or not. So in order to get project data, the project website Amanda's put up on the chat box, but it's also pretty easy to get there just by Googling SLAMM. All of the code, both of the SLAMM model and the DMMT, is open source. And the decision support tool is built in an Excel framework. All the deliverables are there. Our project report is right now with the technical editor, so it should be up. The draft project report should be up fairly soon. If there are specifics that you would want to get from the project report that you don't have, I can send to you excerpts. So the question that Patrick asked, are ecosystem benefits actually modeled, calculated, or specified by the stakeholders and experts? I think hopefully I've clarified how the tool works enough to see that they are actually modeled and calculated. I mean, their relative importance is specified by the stakeholders, but their relative benefit from one site to another is a function of the way that we define the utility functions, and looking at the sort of the acreage of the marsh and the sort of site-specific benefits as well. And we do have a document that describes all the math and all the equations in the tool, which I can send if you're interested, so you can email me for that. Now, what I want to do also is just show a little bit about the DMMT web page. There is a new tutorial that's available that I think if you wanted to start working with this tool, that I think hopefully will be useful to you. So let's see. I don't know why. For some reason, the combination of, there we go, the combination of Firefox and WebEx was resulting in some strange screen rendering. But going through Chrome, under the Dynamic Marsh Management tool here, so we have, as I said, we have 3 different study areas, case studies, New York, Nassau County, and Suffolk County. And you have the tool itself, which is an Excel tool with macros enabled. Now, one thing that we did not realize at the start of this project was that Excel for Mac is not compatible with a type of graph called a pivot chart that's used in Excel, and we use those extensively. So if you use Excel for Mac, you can get outputs, but you're not necessarily going to get the graphs are going to be less dynamic than they would be otherwise. And you need to trust the document so you can run the macros. But you can look at the code if you're suspicious. I promise I'm not trying to steal any of your financial data. It's all out in the world anyway. So there also information about how the parcels are defined for each of these sites, specific definitions of the glossary, and in some cases there are some Google Earth files that will help you move through that. But there's also, if you want to get started, there's a user's guide, which goes through a lot of it, and there's this tutorial, Getting Started with the DMMT. And what this tutorial does is it asks you to go through a bunch of different steps, change model inputs, change model outputs, rerun the model, and answer questions about it. And if you go through this, it should take about an hour. You should pretty much have a good sense of how to use the tool, how to change inputs, how to change outputs, and how the tool is constructed. But if you get stuck on that, there is a video guide where I went through and answered all the questions in the tutorial step by step, showing exactly where to click, exactly how to do different things, how to answer the questions, and the answers that I have for the tutorial. So if you're interested in learning how to use that, this is useful. Because the thing about Excel is that it is a very powerful platform. It's not entirely bulletproof or user-friendly. So it is possible that you can, change your graph axis and suddenly you can be lost, or you can put a letter where there should be a number in place. So we utilize it just due to its power, and I think it's still very powerful. But if you have any questions in terms of how to use this, I think this tutorial should be useful for you. I think that might come to the end of our presentation. Let me go back to the slideshow. So it's been an interesting project, and I really hope that this tool is something that can start to be utilized, and we can start looking at things like, okay, what is the best action under different cost assumptions? Are these optimal adaptation strategies? Are they consistent as you look across a number of different scenarios for cost assumptions. You can also spend a little bit of time at the utility functions. You may have a different, there may be some new literature. Those are all editable as well. So there may be some new literature that suggests different carbon sequestration benefits for different marsh types. This tool, there's also on the website, I neglected to show, but there is instructions for how to get data from any SLAMM simulation, any SLAMM uncertainty analysis simulation into the tool. But the tool actually can be run with deterministic simulations as well. If you just say, let's put equal weighting on each of these 5 sea level rise scenarios. We don't know which one it's going to be, but let's put equal weighting on all 5 of those. That's a simpler way to do that, which will make the tool run faster. So it's pretty much designed to be compatible in any place where SLAMM is available. And again, you can either go through sort of a microeconomic utility model and try to say, okay, what is best in terms of ecosystem benefits overall for these individuals or for these surveyed individuals, or you can simply go from the adaptation strategy assumptions into the total marsh that is predicted to be benefited under that adaptation strategy and the cost of those adaptation strategies. So you don't necessarily have to go through that microeconomic model unless it's something that you're particularly interested in. You also have, I think, a fairly robust way of looking at the relative benefits of different strategies. But I think the thin layer deposition is an interesting one. That's probably the result that is going to make one of the results that's going to make the most waves from this project. And I think that if you're interested in that particularly, I think one of the keys there will be to look at the assumptions that we have in place. Do you believe that 20 centimeters is correct as an application? Do you believe that our assumption that it should only be applied to the low marsh and not a brackish marsh, a higher marsh? We applied thin layer deposition once at the beginning of the simulation. Should we instead be looking at a model where you apply thin layer deposition every 10 years? Obviously, that's going to have an impact on cost, but it's also going to have an impact on benefit as well, because in some cases, by the time these marshes were predicted to be lost, they'd already equilibrated, so there was really no impact on that. Or the timing of the thin layer deposition, or maybe selecting marshes by elevation capital, identifying the marshes which have which really have the least elevation capital and need thin layer deposition now in order to persist for even another 20 years. So I think it's an interesting result, and I do think that the other thing to do would be to look at alternative models of thin layer deposition, especially accounting for these marsh elevation change feedbacks, which is really the way that's really the state of the practice in terms of marsh modeling, is to have some sort of a feedback. Because there's an awful lot of papers, an awful lot of data that suggests that as marshes get lower, they accumulate more inorganic sediments, as well as start putting more energy into their shoots rather than into their roots. And so they potentially can keep up for a while with sea level rise. The problem is if they start putting more of their energy into the shoots, the benefit of that is that there's more shoots to collect more inorganic sediment. And so that's the benefit. The drawback is there's less structural integrity. So what you see is a lot of erosion that is occurring at the marsh edge under some of these stressed out marshes. And so possibly that's something that should be built into the model, and that would then make thin layer deposition more. It's not currently built into the model. I mean, we do model erosion, but not as a function of the root density currently. But that is something that could potentially add some complexity and potentially make thin layer deposition more competitive. It's an interesting result, and I think it's an initial case study result, and I think it bears a lot more scrutiny. But I think it's I do think it's given that people who model marsh fate believe very strongly in the existence of this feedback. The slowing down of accretion rates as marsh get higher in elevation, that sort of works a little bit against the concept of thin layer deposition to some degree, and so I think that and the other finding which we found with the marsh collapse is that we just in the order of 10 to 20 centimeters of marsh capital to these low marshes, just hasn't been particularly important in terms of, especially looking across all model uncertainties, all data uncertainties, and sea level rise uncertainties. If you combine all those together. So I am available for questions for going forward, or if there's no questions, we can end a little bit early. Thank you for your attention. I hope this has been interesting, and I hope this product is something that you can move forward and use or be inspired with in some way. Yes, thank you. Yes, it's we have implemented parallel processing in SLAMM, and that's the only way that we're able to get through these uncertainty analysis runs. We have a server with 32 processors that we put these things on regularly, and it increases things, makes it maybe run about a factor 20 faster. So SLAMM is available on GitHub. And SLAMM 6.7 that includes the parallel processing capabilities is on GitHub. There's a link from the SLAMM webpage to get into that. The parallel processing was a game changer in terms of uncertainty analysis. So thanks for asking that question. Also, 64-bit, that's been there for a while, but that's really important for these large maps. Because one thing that I didn't mention was that we modeled all of these coastal areas in New York State at a 5-meter resolution. So these are very high-resolution maps that we're producing as part of this project.
And related to that, so it's Windows-based?
It is Windows-based currently, yes. Yeah,
and one more question I have. What do you say about the work of Lentz and others that suggest that SLAMM overpredicts marsh inundation?
Who is the author?
Lentz is the one mentioned.
Yeah. Well, I know the paper by Kerwan and Guntensbergen. They actually took a simulation that was a decade old and based their criticism on that. I think that we've addressed those problems with our accretion feedback. I think that that's a criticism from the really the early 2000s. And I think it was a reasonable criticism to some degree. It was a reasonable criticism in that we had not accounted for these accretion feedbacks, and that's part of the reason why I make it so central in these presentations, to show how we're accounting for it and accounting for the uncertainty. However, one of our findings was that the uncertainty in sea level rise really trumps even the uncertainty in accretion rate feedbacks. What we found, at least in this New York study area, was that even a model without accretion feedbacks, I think it always accounted for accretion, but it didn't account for those feedbacks. Even a model without those accretion feedbacks would be reasonably accurate if you get the sea level rise correct. But now I think because we're accounting for the feedbacks, we're using the mechanistic models that are touted by these critics, and specifically to create that feedback relationship. And then we're also accounting for the uncertainty in that, because even these models that are mechanistic have a tremendous amount of uncertainty in terms of, how much sediment is going to be in the water in 50 years, and what the tide range is going to be, and what the settling velocity of that is going to be. So even very highly detailed models that are more mechanistic have a tremendous amount of uncertainty in them going forward. But one of the benefits that SLAMM has versus some of those other models is it's simple enough that you can run it in uncertainty analysis mode, and you can run 200 simulations with different assumptions, and then look at the results as a distribution. So I appreciated their feedback in the mid 2000s, because I think it really improved our modeling. I think it's out of date now, but especially if you look at the predictions that I was showing before, that suggest that with marsh migration, marsh levels are increasing across these study areas, and I think our model is very good. In fact, we've worked with interestingly enough, we worked with Matt Kerwin, and right when he was writing his manuscript with Guntensberg and suggesting that we're over predicting, and we put together a really strong feedback with him, so he was a little bit apologetic for having to go back 10 years to find an application to make the case that we were over predicting marsh loss. So that's my take on it. A little bit prickly, but not too much, because I think that these researchers really have improved our game and our state of our practice. Anything else, Amanda? Where are you seeing these questions? Are they in the chat? They're not in the chat window. Are people emailing you directly?
They're chatting directly to me. So,
oh, I see.
Yeah, so I'm just passing along. I don't have any others at the moment, though.
Okay, great. Well, I guess we can close it now then. Thanks for hosting this, Amanda. It's a big help.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. I appreciate it, and thank you to everyone for attending.
Thanks. Bye.